You're with Papadopoulos on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the fourth hour of my weekend compendium omnibus show, where regular viewers will know here on TNT, we find the facts, do our best to avoid spin and express opinions, but express them openly. If you've not figured it out already, this show is a combination of new guests and then the rest is from the best contributors from the week. Hopefully they wear it as a badge of honor because they get 1 hour to discuss what they've said, what we've touched on during the week. That's roughly how we put it together. And my next guest, who I'll introduce in about 4 or 5 minutes, is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. And he had a fascinating insight into what's going on between the West and Russia. And it ties in very well with where we started, if you were here a few hours ago, with people on the ground in Ukraine. Just before that, I've just got to catch up with some of the comments here. Fascinating. Truth Will Out says the church is not acting in our interests. It's taken over by deep, dark culture. Justin Welby is a Satanist. That could be on a flyover rather than Razumus Shaz was here. Oh, I see. Like graffiti. Well, I'm not sure I necessarily agree that Justin Welby is, but there you are. There's a view. There's an opinion. Luca says, Lambert doesn't have time because he's always on here. Not complaining. I like him. Thank you, Luca. Not sure what you're responding to, but I like being here because I get to speak to people I like talking to. Truth Will Out adds, there's a theory about Mandela that he was being used by MI6. As someone said, they often don't know themselves. Interesting. Heard something interesting about Keir Starmer. Apparently, he was potentially involved with the Secret Service. I don't know for sure. Thanks, Lambert, says John Parsons. No, I meant it. It's a really great question that you asked, and I hope that you find this a happy home for dialogue and for personal enlightenment. Neil Gardner says, I watched the highlights of the 1968 Eurovision Song Contest the other days. Innocent times and most singing in their national language. I totally agree. Where has it gone? Is it just because I'm getting old? Maybe that's the case, but watching it with my children, I was appalled by what I saw in the Eurovision Song Contest, and it seemed to me, compare 1968 with 2024, that's what has gone wrong with our society, in my opinion, or at least it's symptomatic of the problem. Lord Melbury, thanks, Gavin. We'll definitely get him back, I think. Jane Black, not favourable, I know, but that's the conclusion I've come to. God is one, not three. Trinity was made up 150 years ago to decide under Constantine. Certainly you've got a good grasp of theology, Jane Black. I would be interested to know your background. Jane asked Lambert if you can come as a guest on one of his shows. Why not? That's a good point, Luca. Jane, I'd love to have you on as a guest. I would love to cross that Rubicon with some of you. You're so eloquent on the chat. I'd be willing to take a risk, see how it goes. And if you're interested, then get in touch, reach out. Let's see what we can do. That Marcus bloke is good, says Luca. Well, you're going to get a whole hour of Marcus in just a minute. And I really do think you should come on, Jane. You have a lot to say here. And Jane says, I talk non-stop. Well, that's good for me then. Less work for me to do. Right. So thank you very much indeed for those comments. Keep them coming. Now, let me set the scene for my next guest. As those who regularly view my contributions here at today's News Talk TNT know, I'm deeply skeptical of the narrative which is presented about the good fight being fought by Vladimir Zelensky, backed by the might of the Western wallet against the evil Russian Empire. I suspect that the situation, at the very least, needs to be understood in the context of history, which was highlighted by Johnny H. and Ivan, my first two guests today. It goes right back to 2014, not 2022, when various promises were made and various promises were broken. Essentially, the situation, when you start looking at it properly, is far more complex than it's made out to be. I started on this conversation obviously with Johnny H. and Ivan today, but I continued it a few days ago on my breakfast show with Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. He is leading British historian, analyst, and author specializing in Russia and the former Soviet Union. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in Law and Modern History at London Guildhurst University. Received a master's degree in modern history at Royal Holloway, University of London. Also at Royal Holloway was awarded a PhD in Russian history. Goes on, and he knows so much about everything, including British assessments of the Red Army from 1934 to 45. He's received praise from many of Italy's most eminent historians, along with commendations from senior American Army and Air Force officers. Basically, he's very brainy, and he knows more about it than I do. I suspect directionally I have sympathy with the position he takes. But you be the judge, and feel free to be involved in the chat. It's probably going to get quite heavy too, but this is what we're here for. And the Lord Melbury says, Johnny and Ivan were good to listen to. Well, it's a different take on the same subject from a more academic perspective. So after the break, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos.
Your voice heard here.
The government needs to step up and do its job.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Oh, Jane Black says, I am laughing. I will do, Lambert. I grew up on a homestead with books, no electricity, so I read and studied nature. Jane, consider yourself a future, hopefully near future, guest. Let's see how it goes. What's the worst that can happen? Dr. Marcus, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us after our fascinating chat the other day.
Thank you very much, Lembit, for having me back on. I'm immensely looking forward to this discussion.
Why?
Well, because you demonstrated an open mind to when we discussed what is a very, very contentious issue. That is something which is not being demonstrated by any mainstream journalist in either Britain or in America. And that is all the more disturbing when we accept the actuality that there is always two sides to a story. Indeed, there are multiple sides to a story. Nothing is black and white. And anyone who tells you that is either an ignorant, gullible fool or is being paid to do so.
I accept your compliment with humility. Let me set the context. On my breakfast show each day, we have to do a compendium of the news as best we can. And it's a high-powered and necessarily quick take on everything we feel that people should know. On this weekend show, I can go deeper. And what I didn't have time to tell you was my context. My parents were both Estonian from Northern Europe, a former Soviet satellite state. I was born in the United Kingdom because they had to flee as children because of the Soviet system, which did indeed take the lives, for ideological reasons, of a number of my family. I got every reason to hate the Soviet Union and, by extension, Russia, but I don't, because I believe that most people all over the world are roughly the same, and they want roughly the same things. Furthermore, I've never met a perfect politician, the closest being Benazir Bhutto. So the reason I'm so keen to discuss this with you is because you have eruditely summarized my own perception. To quote Sting, the Russians love their children too. And most politicians in all countries aspire to do a good job, however faulty their execution. So I suppose if you feel I'm interested, it's because I have a vested familial interest in this and a personal intuition that it could not possibly be the way that we're having it portrayed by the massive vested interests of the West. So that's the ground that I stand on. Let me ask you a reciprocal question. How did you get to where you are in terms of your analysis? Why do you come to the conclusion that there are two sides to this and every story?
Well, first of all, Lembit, allow me to say this. I have no ties to any government or any state in the world. My opinions are my opinions only. I will never be beholden to anyone in life, be it a government or a state. So when British mainstream journalists or British politicians accuse people like myself of being a Russian propagandist or a Putin apologist, let us examine what are potent accusations. So, again, my stance on the war in Ukraine is my personal opinion, my professional opinion. I am not paid to say that. I have never been paid to say that. Indeed, my opinions on, for example, contemporary Russian foreign policy, or, for example, the origins of the Yugoslav civil wars, have cost me immense damage. Many sacrifices have been made as a result. But again, my opinion is my opinion. If that makes me a Russian propagandist or a Putin apologist, then we are living in a very, very dark, sinister Britain. And indeed, we are living in a dark and sinister Britain, because simply because someone has a different opinion, that does not mean they are a propagandist for any government in the world. It means they have a different opinion. And whenever a British journalist or a British politician accuses someone else of being a Putin apologist or a Russian propagandist, we must confront them. So I first began warning of an inevitable war in Ukraine back in 2007, because NATO expansion into Eastern Europe and into the Baltic states, which used to be a part of the former Soviet Union, was always going to antagonize Russia, was always going to make Russia feel threatened. So why did the West in the late 1990s begin the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe? Well, first of all, the 1990s were the most catastrophic period in the history of Russia. Politically, economically, culturally, socially, and militarily, Russia was on its knees. But the West in the 1990s believed this, that whilst Russia had become a decimated force, one day it could become a great power again. It could restore its superpower status, which it had in the Soviet period. So expanding NATO to Russia's western borders would effectively place a cordon sanitaire on the Russian Federation from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, effectively enclosing Russia on its western borders. If Russia is enclosed on its western borders, if Russia is weakened in Europe, that means Russia will be weakened in the world as a whole. And if we look at a map of modern day Europe in Eastern Europe, from the Baltic Sea all the way to Bulgaria, Russia is surrounded by NATO states. However, the most important country that NATO had been coveting ever since December of 1991, when this country became an independent country, which took its population by complete surprise, was Ukraine. Because Ukraine has an enormous industrial and agricultural base. Also, the geostrategic importance of Ukraine to both Russia and the West is simply breathtaking. So a Ukraine in NATO would mean that Russian national security would be in serious jeopardy. Why? Because NATO would effectively become the dominant naval power in the Black Sea. NATO troops and NATO weaponry, in particular missiles, would flood Ukraine. NATO tactical aircraft operating, let's say, from the Kharkov Oblast or the Kiev Oblast could reach Moscow in between 10 and 15 minutes. Also, Lembit, the nuclear parity which exists to this day between America and Russia, which is absolutely imperative for global peace, would become destabilized and would tilt in favor of America if Ukraine was in NATO. And furthermore, the lands which comprise Ukraine are central to the Russian national identity. Lenin, after coming to power, or after the end of the Russian Civil War in 1922, he began a process of map making in Soviet Russia, internal borders. So lands such as Novorossiya, for example, in the southern part and the eastern part of what is Ukraine today, were lumped together in what became known as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, something that Stalin was completely against, but of course Lenin was in charge. All of the borders, apart from the Baltic states, all of the borders within the old Soviet Union were 100% artificial. But when the Soviet Union was in existence, those internal borders didn't mean anything. But when Soviet power ended in December of 1991, those internal borders became national borders. And what is so important, Lembit, is for people to know this. Again, the Baltic states was an exception to this. That was a very different matter. But the Baltic states, I said, was an exception. But the westernmost part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, together with the Baltic states, were the only regions of the USSR which never wanted to be a part of the country. In March of 1991, Gorbachev held a referendum in the Soviet Union in which the Soviet people were asked, do you wish to preserve the Soviet Union? 76% of the Soviet people voted yes. In the Ukraine, as it was known as, the Ukraine then, the figure was over 70%. So this idea that has been peddled by the West that the Soviet Union was a prison of peoples is not correct. Again, the Baltic states is an exception to that. So this idea that the people in Ukraine and in Russia are alien to each other is a complete and utter grotesque falsehood. The only part of Ukraine where you will find anti-Russian sentiment is in the westernmost part, Lvov, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, Volyn and Rivne. Why? Because for hundreds of years, those regions were controlled by the Poles, the Lithuanians and the Austrians. And that's why many of the people there are Catholic. They are not Eastern Orthodox. There is a lot of Polish, Lithuanian and Austrian blood there. That is not Russian propaganda. That is not being a Putin apologist. That is a historical reality. If you go to the archives in Kew, the National Archives in London, have a look in the 19th century, you will not find a British official, such as a British diplomat, referring to a Ukrainian race. Why is that?
Hold that thought. I want you to answer that in just a minute. We need to go to a break. Let me summarize the story so far. Essentially, it's a false prospectus, according to what you're saying, to claim that Ukraine has been hankering after its independence away from Russia, and that this oft-repeated mantra that Ukraine should be allowed to self-determination, independence, and we have to raise exert every force to support Vladimir Zelensky is basically based on a misinterpretation or even a lie. Is that essentially what you said so far?
Yes.
Hold that thought. We're going to go to a break, but you left us on a cliffhanger there. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say next. Neil Gardner's put a very interesting message. I'm going to paraphrase that as well. Do keep your calls and comments coming. I'm Lembit Topik. I'm with Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, and we're talking about Ukraine. All of that with me here on TNT in just a moment.
I said, could she die? And the doctor said she could. It was so scary.
When I started clawing at my neck and trying to breathe, and I thought, what are we going to do if I die here? How's everyone going to go on?
When someone's gravely sick or injured in the bush, they rely on the Royal Flying Doctor Service. But now the Flying Doctor needs your help to fund vital medical equipment and supplies. Please search Flying Doctor online to give a regular gift of just $10. you can help equip the Flying Doctor's teams to respond to any emergency anywhere. Search Flying Doctor online. Become a part of the Royal Flying Doctor Service and help save lives in the bush.
Affordable housing, we can build that. Sustainable housing, we can build that. At MIT Modular, we understand the importance of housing for all and the importance of design, cost, and functionality. Our goal is to meet the needs of our growing population by converting shipping containers to livable units. If you're like-minded and in a position to invest in something meaningful and life-changing, we want to hear from you. We are a team of professional architects, engineers, and financial and tax experts dedicated to offering unique solutions that provide a brighter future. Our Opportunity Zone Fund offers investors both real estate and operating business diversification, 5-year tax deferral on capital gains, annual tax benefits, and ultimately tax-free appreciation potential. There are opportunity zones all over America. If you're interested in learning more about our services, need affordable housing, or want to participate in creating a new vision for tomorrow, give us a call in the U.S. on 385-985-5702. Or read more at mitmodular.com. MIT Modular. We can build that.
Today's News Talk Radio.
I do a lot of streaming radio.
I do a lot of free streaming.
TNTradio.live.
Welcome back. I'm having a fascinating conversation, or at least I'm finding it interesting, with Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos about the history behind the Ukraine situation. And it's a very different interpretation to what you get fed by, in my view, the extremely superficial and I would say politically biased mainstream media. Back to Dr. Marcus in just a minute. A few comments here. Neil Gardner's asking about how many deaths are attributable to the Nazis versus Stalin. Stalin, in my view, not a good man. A really very bad person, in my view, and responsible for the death of members of my family, actually. But I don't let that make me hate Russia or the Soviet Union. That's a misunderstanding. To hate a nation because of its leaders would be to hate Britain because of Keir Starmer. And we don't seem to make that reciprocal analogy. Schrodinger's cat's excited that Jane Black's going to be a future guest. I have so much to say that would be in contradiction to her message. Hope you're prepared to read out my opposite views. Yes, of course. When she's here, when Jane's here, she gets the same respect and the same exposure to free speech as everybody else, including me, by the way, including me. Lord Melbury thinks it's brilliant. You're going to be on, Jane. You're kind of under pressure now. You have to come on. Lucas says 1922, which could be something to do with a very significant year in Irish history. Just a bloke, you'll be a wonderful guest, Jane. Have always thoroughly enjoyed your appearances on other TNT broadcasts. Well, there we are. You're going to be on mine soon. Truth will out. Be good to see you on here, Jane. Old Ricky Munn will tune in too, no doubt. Well, there we go. Neil's just had a nuisance call. I know what they're like. It's just awful. It's very, very irritating when people interfere with our freedom there. Fantastic news, Just a Bloke says as well about Jane's attendance here. Will Russia occupy the Baltic states? My daughter's ex-boyfriend is Latvian and fears they might, says Neil Gardner. My judgment, I'll ask Marcus in a moment, my judgment is they won't. Generally lots of thumbs up for Jane coming on here. Keep your calls and comments coming. Back to you, Dr. Marcus. Just a quick one before we go back to the main thread. Do you think there's any prospect of Russia occupying the Baltic states? I don't, and I go to Estonia regularly, the land of my mother and father.
No, I do not believe so. For Russia, it is absolutely imperative to ensure what I call its soft underbelly is remedied. And of course, I'm talking about Ukraine. Russia will never countenance a Ukraine in NATO. That's why it commenced in February of 2022, a Russian military campaign there. If Russia is successful in Ukraine, which I have absolutely no doubt it will be, that will be the end of the matter. I do not believe that Russia or the Russian army will advance into the westernmost parts of Ukraine. Why? Because it would not be in the interests of Russian internal security to have populations who despise everything about Russia. That is why I believe the Russian army will advance to and capture the oblasts of Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, which are to the west of Kiev. And after that, I strongly suspect the Russian army will end its campaign, and then its security in the south will be guaranteed. As for the Baltic states, as we know, they're members of NATO, and if Russia, hypothetically speaking, was to take military action in the Baltic states, then Article 5 would be invoked. Russia does not want a war with NATO. And I actually do not believe, Lembit, that America wants a war with Russia. Why? Because a conventional war between America and Russia would quickly escalate into a nuclear exchange between the two superpowers, which would see the end of America, the end of Russia, and the end of the rest of the world. The Western Military District in the Russian Federation, which of course goes up to the Baltic states, is extremely large, extremely powerful. The Russian enclave of Kaliningrad in the Baltic Sea, again, is heavily militarized, is extremely powerful. So Russia can contain what the Kremlin refers to as the threat in the Baltic states emanating from NATO. So again, once the Russian army is victorious in Ukraine, which it will be, that will be the end of the matter. This idea, which is being peddled again by British mainstream journalists, that the Russians want to take control of Poland, they want to take control of Slovakia and Romania, is based on what? Do they ever corroborate these assertions with even an ounce of tangible evidence? No, they don't. You have politicians, members of the House of Commons, members of the House of Lords, who quite frankly know nothing about Ukraine. They know nothing about Russia. And yet they go on television and they make the allegation that Russia wants to conquer Poland, for example. How would that be conducive to internal Russian stability, to have millions of people, of a population who despise Russia? And remember, there's bad blood between Poland and Russia, and it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. The Poles have done some very bad things. The Russians have done some very bad things. Russia is not an angel. I've said that on many occasions. Russia is not whiter than white. But I would say this, Lembit, that Russia does not pretend to be an angel. Russia does not pretend to be the beacon of democracy in the world. Russia has its own form of democracy which suits its own ways, which suits its own unique set of historical experiences. But Britain and America claim to be an angel. They claim to be the beacon of civilization, the heart of democracy, the heart of civilization. That is absolutely preposterous nonsense. North Korea, I respect North Korea. Why? I'm against a one-party state. Fundamentally, I absolutely oppose a one-party state. But the North Koreans openly say they are a one-party state, and they give reasons why they are a one-party state. I respect them for their honesty. But Britain and America to claim that they are a democracy, the upholders of international law, is absolutely disgusting. And they are mocking the deaths of millions of people whom they caused the deaths of through their wars and through their sanctions.
So the way we look at it is, by the way, not everybody agrees with what you're saying, but let me just proceed with this anyway. One thing Neil Gardner is saying, could Russia not have avoided killing 400,000 plus Ukrainian soldiers? I'll just read these because I want to keep up to date with them. And then I recall going out for a pizza with a Russian woman in London, says Neil. When she learned the waitress was Lithuanian, she wanted to go elsewhere. They're all Nazis, she said. I think she grew up in St. Petersburg. And Truth Will Out says NATO have been waging a proxy war, mainly driven by the UK City of London old colonial establishment against Russia to destabilize Russia and split her into 10 separate states and set globalist puppets to rob the resources. I'm not asking you to respond to all of those. I'm just keeping up to date with the commentary. Just a couple of points. Now, I go to Estonia quite often, and Estonia is wary of its neighbour, but very keen to maintain good relations because economically it's really important. Estonia is a useful port, and by and large, the 30% or so of the Estonian population, which is Russian, doesn't really want to get nuked either. And they made an amazingly peaceful transition, I think, in the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and they want to maintain that. Bulgaria, where I go to very often, 75% of the population, I think, is actually pro-Russian. 2/3 of the government there is pro-Russian, and they're a NATO country. Is it possible that a small number of hoi polloi, self-serving people, and I know I'm using pejorative phrases, but this is how I feel, in NATO are trying to promote their own power for whatever reason at the cost of Russia, even though the dog in the street can see, under the circumstances, number one, as you say, Russia is existentially committed to protecting its interest in the Ukraine area, and on number two, militarily, we can't win anyway.
Yes, absolutely. Russia is not only a nuclear superpower, but is also a military superpower. True, it is still not a military superpower as it was in the Soviet period, but that is rapidly changing. And the more lands which comprise Ukraine, which are captured by the Russian army, such as Odessa or Dnipropetrovsk or Kharkov, will increase the military power of Russia. So that is why the day that the Russian army entered Ukraine, it meant that the Russian army would never leave Ukraine and would never be dislodged by NATO's Ukrainian army or NATO by proxy itself. And this is what is extremely depressing, Lembit. If British mainstream media in the 1960s or in the 1970s, for example, had portrayed the Russian military as a third-rate power, the average British person would have dismissed it as absolute nonsense, as absolute insanity. But today, and I say this with a heavy heart, Lembit, the average British person has lost their soul, has lost their mind, because they have embraced decadence in the form of celebrity culture, reality television, Netflix and whatnot. So British mainstream media has, in the last 2.5 years, has been allowed to portray Russia as a backward military force. British newspapers have been running articles claiming that old age pensioners in Ukraine are using rifles to shoot down Russian combat jets. They are running articles saying that Ukrainian housewives standing on the balconies of their flats are bringing down Russian drones by throwing jars of tomatoes at them. That demonstrates what has happened to the British population. The reality, of course, is that the Russian military is a colossus, is a juggernaut. The Russian military complex, the Russian military industrial complex is even bigger than its American equivalent. Russian armaments factories in Russia, such as in Magnitogorsk, they are larger than towns in America or in Britain. And the armament sector in Russia, or as it was in the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991, were developed to sustain the Soviet armed forces in a war with America. And of course, the Russian Federation inherited the vast amounts of the Soviet military industrial complex. So, for example, Lembit, Russia could lose 100 tanks in Ukraine in 1 week. The following week, they'll be replaced with another 100 tanks. Russia can call up, if it wants to, over 22 million soldiers. They could lose 5,000 soldiers in 1 month. The next month, there'll be another 5,000 Russian soldiers there. That is why the Ukrainian army cannot and can never win this contest. Yes, NATO, by flooding, saturating Ukraine with hardware, of course, means that the Russian military is not just fighting the Ukrainian army, it is fighting by proxy NATO. And that, of course, has slowed down the Russian advance. But look what has happened. The Ukrainian army has incurred over 1.5 million losses, of which 600,000 are fatalities. NATO has seen its military stockpiles severely depleted. There is a type of ammunition in America, Lembit, which is so low now. One American general said that it will take America approximately 10 years to replace this particular type of ammunition. And one other point, we hear even this week British politicians and British mainstream journalists again repeating a lie that Putin, at the very start of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine, said that the war will be over in 3 days. Putin never said that. No member of the Russian high command said that. But I will tell you who said that. The former chairman of the American Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, he's the one who said, just before the Russian military campaign in Ukraine began, he said if the Russian army enters Ukraine, it will be over, the Russians will be victorious in 3 days. I say to you, Lembit, I say to your audience, don't take my word for it. Just do a basic search on the internet and you will see that Putin never said that. The Russian high command never said that. It was Mark Milley who said that. And yet, British mainstream journalists, for example, and their columnists are peddling a blatant lie, attributing that 3-day claim to the Russians. The Russians knew it would never take 3 days. I believe they underestimated the extent of weaponry which NATO would supply the Ukrainian army with. I did. I said in my book, Arise Russia, that if the Russians entered Ukraine, then the West would place thousands upon thousands upon thousands of sanctions on Ukraine. And to date, there are over 12,000 Western sanctions on Russia. So I was correct about that. I said in my book and on television that if the Russians enter Ukraine, NATO will supply significant amounts of hardware to Ukraine. But I didn't think they would supply such amounts whereby they would deplete their own stockpiles. That has been absolutely reckless. But again, the 3-day claim was made by Mark Milley, the former head of the American Chiefs of Staff.
There's an irony as well. The Russian economy is slated to probably grow faster than the British economy, despite all the sanctions. So that's an unintended consequence. We'll come back to you in just a moment, Marcus. On a separate matter, I just want to remind you about Don't Die July campaign. As winter settles in Australia, the Don't Die July campaign really reminds us that safety never takes a holiday. Heart attacks happen actually more frequently in winter, apparently, claiming the lives of one person every 12 minutes in Australia. Did you know that? So the advice is to embrace the season with peace of mind. Explore don'tdiejuly.com today and make heart safety a priority for you as well, and actually for your whole family. And you can sign up today very easily. Just visit don'tdiejuly.com to find out more about this initiative. And just remember, CPR saves lives. I had Steve, the great actor who you see in the adverts, on my show during the week. Very eloquent. He had a personal interest in it as well. His son suffered an experience. So don't let that happen to your family. Go to the don'tdiejuly.com website and find out more. I'll remind you after the break as well, just one more time. Coming up after the break, it's me and Dr. Marcus bringing us to the top of the hour. All of that with me, Lembit Turpik, here on TNT. See you in a minute.
When I had my heart event close to 4 years ago, I was at the gym, thought I deserve a coffee and thought I'll top up with fuel, ordered a coffee. But while I was pumping fuel, I started to get chest pains. Then it got worse and worse and worse. So then I was leaning on the counter thinking, yeah, something's not quite right. So then I went to wait for the coffee And that's when it really, really hit. And Joy just, mouthed, "Do you need an ambulance?" And I remember nodding. I wasn't even thinking about a heart attack. I just thought something is seriously wrong with me here. So when the cardiologist came to see me, she informed me that I'd had what they call a widowmaker heart attack. Bit of a shock when someone says, you nearly died. Everybody should be aware of all the symptoms of a heart attack that women can have that aren't typical of the shoulder pain, the right arm pain. I go to the gym, I do yoga, Pilates, I swim, I go on bike rides, and yet I still had a heart attack. You just don't know it could be you.
When a crisis hits, close to home and across the globe, nonprofits are on the front lines, ready to serve. Healing, nurturing, rescuing, protecting, inspiring. The work of philanthropic organizations has never been more important, and it's donors and volunteers like you who make all this possible. Thank you. The Nonprofit Alliance.
Papadopoulos on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back. Just got a quarter of an hour, but I do want to emphasize this point, the one I made before. Don't ignore this, please. I can only ask you not to ignore it. This July, let's celebrate winter responsibly with the Don't Die July campaign. Now, you can have frosty adventures or cozy nights by the fire, but heart safety is still a priority. And that's why we're trying to promote it here at today's News Talk TNT. So go to www.don'tdiejuly.com and get the whole family involved. And it's actually quite a lot of fun. It's a 30-minute CPR course. It's not boring. It's actually really quite straightforward. And enjoy, basically earning a life-saving skill together. What's not to like about that? So you can sign up today. Once again, visit don'tdiejuly.com and find out more about this initiative. And just remember, CPR saves lives. There's no doubt about it. And just think how good you'll feel if you do that. And it does help you save a life, and how bad you feel if you don't. I'm not going to lay it on with a trial, but I just really hope that you go and do that. I think it's a really worthwhile thing to do. Let's return to the subject in hand, which is really what's going on in terms of the Ukraine situation. A very different take from Dr. Marcus to what you normally hear on the mainstream media. A story so far, it seems to me that what you're saying, Dr. Marcus, is that the situation is completely misrepresented in the Western mainstream media, that we're actually depleting our own military resources, probably to no avail, and this pointless toll of death must, and you haven't said this explicitly, but it must fall onto the hands of the West for supporting the militarily inexperienced Zelensky, who seems to be doing the West's bidding. I know I'm using quite emotive language here, but it seems to me, since we're going to have to negotiate a peace settlement eventually, we're just making it worse for ourselves by waiting.
I first became aware of Zelensky in around 2010, and it was very evident to me then that as an actor, as a comedian, and I use those words in a very loose way, he had a great lust for money, materialism, and global stardom. When he used to appear in around 2010 on Ukrainian television, he used to make pleas to Vladimir Putin, asking Putin, please allow me to appear on Russian television. And sometime after, he began appearing on Russian television. Also, prior to him having been selected to be the president of Ukraine, because after the February 2014 coup in Ukraine, and it was a coup, he became selected. He was selected. But prior to 2014, and again, Lembit, I say this to you and your audience, don't take my word for it. Go on the internet, go on social media. Zelensky was uttering a historical fact. He said Russians and Ukrainians are one people. They are East Slavs. So why the change of opinion? What has happened? Of course, what he said then, as I said, is a historical truth. Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are East Slavs, and they are overwhelmingly adherents to the Russian Orthodox faith. Again, in the westernmost part of Ukraine, that is where you will find many Catholics. But this idea, which has been peddled, for over 30 years now in the West, that the people in Ukraine are completely distinct in cultural terms to the Russian people, is just preposterous nonsense. So many members of the Russian High Command have their roots in Ukraine. And also, even to this day, many members of the Ukrainian security apparatus have their roots in Russia. And also, when senior Ukrainian government officials are talking on television, they say they're talking in a Ukrainian language. Well, it's not. It's a Ukrainian dialect from the westernmost part of Ukraine. But, Lembit, they quickly slip into pure Russian. Again, what does that tell you? Then we have how the word Kiev has been changed to Kiev. For over 1,000 years in the English language, that city, the birthplace of the first Russian state in history, Kiev and Rus, was only referred to as Kiev. And now, in the last 2.5 years, it's been referred to as Kiev. What does that tell you? This is a deliberate and systematic distortion of history. Again, Russia is not an angel. Russia is not whiter than white, but Russia should not have NATO on its borders. And again, if there was a Russian-led military alliance in Mexico, I would be one of the first to condemn that, because that would be a threat to American national security. And the national security of America and Russia must be respected and must be preserved, because America and Russia hold the fate of the world in their hands, because they account for over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. But what do we see now? NATO on Russia's doorstep. And NATO is not a peaceful defensive military bloc. It demonstrated that in 1999, when it illegally and murderously bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It not only violating international law, it violated its own founding treaty, Article 1 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which says that NATO will never use force to resolve a dispute. And who did they bomb? They bombed the Serbs, historic friends and allies of Russia, indeed brothers of the Russian people. Then NATO supported Islamist terrorists in Libya. Then they supported Islamist terrorists in Syria. And we are led to believe that NATO is a peaceful military bloc. Maybe before 1999, that argument could have been made, but that is certainly not the case now. When Russian national security is threatened, then the Kremlin will take decisive action, as the Americans would. Look what happened when Khrushchev deployed ICBMs to Cuba. Kennedy took very decisive action, though we should also bear in mind that the main reason for Khrushchev deploying ICBMs to Turkey was because the Americans had nuclear weapons in Turkey. And at that time, Turkey shared a border with the Soviet Union. Nothing is black and white, and I'm not condoning what Khrushchev did, but that is something that most people in Britain and America are ignorant of. But the point is that the Americans took decisive action when Khrushchev deployed ICBMs to Cuba, because that was a threat to American national security.
Yeah, just one clarification. You said to Turkey, so essentially, just for clarification, America was putting ICBMs into Turkey, and Khrushchev tried to put ICBMs into Cuba. So there was a reciprocal there, which didn't really nearly led to war, but actually de-escalated between the 19th and the 28th of October, 1962, I believe. Now, if what you're saying is correct, looking to the future, it seems inevitable from leaving aside the politics, from a military point of view, the West can't win, because the Russian supply chain is 100 kilometers. The Western supply chain is thousands of kilometers. Secondly, the Russian army is ready, willing, and able to do this. the Ukrainian army is taking incredible and probably worse casualties, I'm guessing. You may be able to confirm this otherwise, than the Russians. But fundamentally, democracies get bored of this kind of thing. So all Putin really has to, leaving aside the politics of it in terms of right and wrong, he just has to wait. And eventually the West will give up on this.
I agree with your analysis, Lembit. For not just the Kremlin, for the average Russian, Ukraine is personal because it is at the heart of the Russian national identity, because Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities. British diplomats were saying that in the 19th century. They were saying that in the 18th century. Again, you don't have to take my word for it. Go to the National Archives in Kew, find those documents, and you will see what British diplomats were saying. The Russian army cannot be defeated in Ukraine. It has an enormous armament sector there which can sustain it. For 2.5 years, up until a few months ago, Western politicians and Western journalists were saying that the Russian army has incurred losses of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. That was absolute nonsense. At the beginning of the year, Lembit, I did my own calculations on how many Russian soldiers have died. And you can go onto my YouTube channel and you will see it. And around January or February this year, I calculated 50,000 Russian soldiers have died so far. A couple of months later, the British Ministry of Defence released their own figures of how many Russian soldiers have died. They said that exact figure, 50,000. Well, what happened to the hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers who had died? That was propaganda in order to justify the ongoing financial support to Zelensky and his associates, to say to the British people, to say to the American people, Zelensky can win this. The Russians have lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But note, how many British media outlets covered what the British Ministry of Defence said a few months ago when they cited their own figure of 50,000 dead Russian soldiers for the amount of land in Ukraine which the Russian army have captured? 50,000, and I'm talking now in a purely military context. 50,000 is not a lot. But again, if the Russians want to replace 50,000 dead soldiers, they can do it within a very short period of time. Remember, they can call up over 22 million soldiers if need be. That's never going to happen. Only in a war with America would Russia declare total war. They don't need to declare war, total war in Ukraine. The Russian military-industrial complex, how much has it devoted so far to the war in Ukraine? I would estimate between 10 and 15%. Again, that is very, very little. If the Russians want to up the ante, so to speak, in Ukraine, they can do it, but they don't have to. They are bleeding to death, the Ukrainian army, and by proxy, they are bleeding to death NATO. And the day will come, and I believe this year, when the Russian army will launch simultaneously enormous offensives, which will demonstrate how Russia is this military colossus, this almighty steamroller, which can be clumsy, which can be inefficient, which can be disorganized. But history shows when this almighty Russian steamroller gets going, it crushes all before it.
And you said 50,000 dead Russians, 600,000 dead Ukrainians. It's not how it's portrayed.
Yes. And I mean, that's not just my figure. Ukrainian sources are saying that. For example, on Telegram, independent military analysts are saying that. And that figure that figure was from a few months ago. I suspect it has increased somewhat since then. So 600,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers, which is a disgusting loss of life, compared to 50,000 dead Russian soldiers, which, again, more important than my calculation, is the calculation of the British Ministry of Defence. Again, don't take my word for it. See what the British Ministry of Defence said a few months ago.
Thank you so much. We've covered so much ground today, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. I hope that you feel it's been a worthwhile time having the deeper analysis. I would summarize it, we're just about to finish, in this way, that those people who say it's an unwinnable war and we shouldn't be fighting it in the first place are basically right.
I concur wholeheartedly. There are so many serious problems being deliberately inflicted by the British ruling elite in Britain and the American ruling elite in America. That's where the problem is. Why is the Royal Navy not defending Britain's maritime waters in the English Channel? Why is that?
Because they're over there, I suppose. Thank you so much. We're out of time now. Really appreciate your academic and comprehensive analysis, and obviously we'll discuss these things again. And with that, we're out of time. I thank Dr. Marcus for his time. I thank all my guests and my team. More than anything, I thank you. You've been really lively today. Sorry I didn't get to all your comments, but we have got Jane Black to look forward to some point in the future. I'll be back again on Monday morning, 0800 UK time, afternoon in Australia. I hope you have a great rest of the weekend. Hope you've learned something. I certainly have. I'm Len Vitopic. This is TNT, home of free speech. See you in a couple of days.